My cousin neglected his daughter for 16 years due to his wife's influence, so I stepped in on her 18th birthday, which didn't sit well with them. Here's the story: my wife, 27, and I, 30, own a large farm, about 300 acres, with a 5-bedroom, 3-bathroom house. We even set it up with electrical hookups for campers, aiming to create a place where our whole family could gather during summer or holidays. We specifically designed it this way, hoping to make it a spot where everyone could come, relax, and stay as long as they liked, like one of those homes that naturally becomes the go-to place for family gatherings. For a while it worked perfectly. Every summer our home was filled with cousins, aunts, uncles, and kids playing in the fields, people gathered around the fire pit, and campers set up across the land. It really felt like the heart of the family. Among this crowd was my cousin Bill, who's now 56. He's always been a regular, bringing his kids along whenever the family came over. Bill has a daughter, Alice, who's now 18, from his first marriage. Her mother, an immigrant without any relatives nearby, sadly passed away when Alice was just 2. It was a tough time. Bill remarried pretty quickly. Just 6 months later he married Tanya, who's now 52, and they went on to have 3 more children. But in their home, everything revolves around their 2 oldest sons and their youngest daughter, the kids they had together. Alice, on the other hand, is practically ignored. Even I can see how much they leave her out, and I'm no expert. It's like she's just an afterthought. Bill and Tanya take their kids on trips and sign them up for activities, while Alice stays behind, never getting the same opportunities. She's left to manage on her own, without vacations or extracurriculars. I've known Alice for years. She spent the past 4 summers at our farm, and I think it's mainly because Bill and Tanya wanted her out of their way. They often complain about her, calling her disrespectful and troublesome, saying she needs to learn manners. I'm not saying she's perfect, but it's clear she's just craving some attention. Now Alice can be difficult, I won't deny that. She has that classic teenage attitude, acting like she doesn't care about anything, and she's loud. There have been many times when she's come to our place, and I'd hear about her explosive arguments with her stepmom, complete with shouting and slamming doors, often over trivial issues. It's like she's always ready for a fight. You might think this kid is such a brat, and yeah, maybe she seems like that sometimes, but if you dig deeper, it's easy to see why she's acting out. From what I've observed, this rebellious side only emerged when she realized she wasn't being treated like her siblings. She's like a different person when she's away from home, polite, quiet, and trying to blend in, whether it's around her teachers, our farm crew, or even strangers. But as soon as she's back home, it's like everything falls apart. It's almost like she's 2 people: the Alice everyone else sees and the Alice around her dad and stepmom. It's no surprise she's so angry, and what's truly baffling is that Bill and Tanya don't seem to notice. They act like everything's great with their other kids, but when it comes to Alice, she's always the issue. They never consider maybe we're contributing to the problem. A few summers back, she started working on our farm because Bill and Tanya wanted her out of their house, but honestly, she's pretty good at the job. Once she has something to focus on, she really puts in the effort. She's great with the animals, and she's even learned a few handy skills like fixing fences and handling some of the equipment. She seems to enjoy being here, probably because it gives her a break from all the tension at home. We liked having her around, and it felt good to see her learning the value of hard work and feeling like she was part of something. This summer, things got a lot more complicated. Alice was turning 18, and I could see it would be a tough time. Bill kept going on about how he planned to kick her out as soon as she turned 18, saying it would teach her responsibility. But I couldn't help but think, really? You're just sending her off with no plan, no safety net. Just like that, I couldn't see how that would help her learn anything useful. We talked to Alice about it a few times, and you could tell she was anxious. She had nowhere to go, and her dad seemed serious about following through with his plan. My wife and I decided that if it came down to it, we'd take her in. We had the space, and we figured, why not help her get back on her feet? Maybe we could guide her toward college or a job. She deserved at least that much of a chance. The night before her birthday, we invited Alice over for dinner. She mostly picked at her food and seemed lost in her thoughts. My wife tried to discuss her plans after graduation, but Alice just shrugged. She had no idea what to do, and it wasn't hard to see why. Her parents hadn't exactly set her up for success. Later, my wife and I talked things over. We knew taking her in might stir up some trouble, but leaving her on her own wasn't an option. It felt like watching someone struggle to stay afloat. You don't just stand by when you can help. So we decided that first thing in the morning we'd go to her place, load up her belongings, and bring her home. When we pulled up bright and early, Alice seemed stunned. She had prepared herself for her dad's rejection, but she clearly hadn't expected anyone to show up for her. We loaded her belongings, just the things she'd bought herself or received as gifts. I wasn't about to take anything Bill and Tanya might claim as theirs. She stayed quiet the whole time, like she couldn't believe it was really happening. As we drove away, she finally spoke up, thanking us in a way that felt full of relief, like a huge burden had just been lifted. I didn't say much, just told her we were happy to have her. It felt like the right thing to do, offering her a chance to build her own life without the weight of her parents' neglect. We didn't have all the answers, but we figured if we could help someone who needed it, why wouldn't we? After Alice moved in, things changed quickly. At first, everything seemed fine. She was quiet, likely trying to adjust to her new surroundings. We set her up in a guest room with plenty of space, her own bathroom, and some privacy. We wanted her to feel like this was her home, not just a temporary arrangement. We assured her that she could stay as long as she needed no rush to figure out her next steps. Now I don't have kids, so I'm not pretending to know everything about raising one, especially not a teenager, but I knew enough to see that Alice was carrying a lot of emotional baggage from her dad and stepmom. You can't just erase years of feeling neglected just because you're in a new place. So we took it slow, giving her space to open up if she wanted to. In those first few days, she mostly kept to herself, coming down for meals and helping out on the farm when needed. But other than that, she stayed quiet. I guessed she was still trying to make sense of everything. You can't blame her. One day she's being kicked out, and the next, she's living with her cousin on a farm. That's a lot to process, especially for an 18-year-old who's been through so much. My wife was amazing through it all. She has this gift for making people feel welcome. She'd leave out snacks for Alice, made sure her room had everything she might need, and even got her a small TV for her space. It was her way of saying, "You're welcome here." Gradually, Alice started to come out of her shell. She began helping more with the animals and even joined us for dinner, occasionally with a smile. But naturally, that's when things got more complicated. It didn't take long for Bill and Tanya to catch wind of what was going on. Word spreads quickly in our family, especially when you've got a big property like ours, always buzzing with visitors. They must have heard from someone that Alice was staying with us, and they weren't pleased. A couple of days after Alice moved in, Bill called, and from the start, you could tell he was upset. No small talk, just straight to the point. "What's this I hear about Alice staying with you?" I wasn't going to lie. "Yeah, she's here. You said she had to leave when she turned 18 and she had nowhere else to go. So we thought we'd help her out." He let out a heavy sigh, clearly annoyed. "You know that's not helping her. We were trying to teach her some responsibility." I'm not one for arguments over the phone, but that struck a nerve. I tried to keep calm. "Bill, she's been through a lot. I'm not saying I know better than you, but throwing her out without a plan wasn't going to help her. She's still a kid who needs a stable place to figure things out." He wasn't having any of it. "She's not your responsibility. She's mine. You think you're helping, but you're just getting in the way of what we're trying to teach her." My patience was running thin. "Well, Bill, if teaching her responsibility means leaving her out in the cold, then yeah, I guess I am getting in the way, but as long as she's with us, she's safe and she's welcome here." We went back and forth for a while, but it felt like talking to a brick wall. He kept insisting that it was his role to parent her, that we were overstepping, and that we didn't understand what was best for Alice. Eventually, I'd had enough. "Look, man, she's staying here as long as she wants. If you've got a problem with that, I don't know what to tell you." He hung up after that, and I knew things were about to get messy. Sure enough, the next day my phone started buzzing with calls and texts from family members. Apparently, Bill and Tanya had been spreading the word that we had taken Alice away from them, and now they were refusing to attend any more family events unless she was gone. It felt like a real slap in the face, especially since we'd always been the ones hosting and making sure everyone felt welcome. Now, just because we took in Alice, suddenly we were the outcasts. My wife was furious. She's the kind of person who puts her heart into making others feel at home, and to have people turn on us like that was painful. Aunt Linda was the next to reach out, and she tried to be diplomatic about it. "It's not that they don't appreciate what you're doing for Alice, they just feel like you're stepping over the line. Bill and Tanya have their own way of doing things, and they feel like you're going against them." I didn't mince words. "Aunt Linda, I'm not trying to start trouble here, but Alice needed a place, and we had room. I'm not going to turn her away just because Bill and Tanya don't agree with it. She's family, and we have space for her." She sighed, clearly trying to find some compromise. Maybe if Alice lived somewhere else, like a dorm or an apartment, it might help. That way, Bill and Tanya wouldn't feel like you're taking sides. I didn't know how to respond to that. It seemed like everyone cared more about keeping things smooth with Bill and Tanya than thinking about what was best for Alice. I understand people don't like conflict, but sometimes you have to stand firm. I told Aunt Linda that Alice was welcome to stay with us as long as she wanted, and that was the end of that discussion. Afterward, the calls and messages kept rolling in. Some cousins even said they wouldn't be bringing their kids over anymore, using excuses like gas prices, or that it wasn't worth the trip if others weren't coming. It all just sounded like a way to avoid picking sides, but it was clear they had. My wife and I spent hours talking about how to handle the whole situation. She was worried about the family tension, but she had no regrets about helping Alice, and neither did I. We both agreed that if we could give Alice a stable environment where she felt she belonged, then it was worth the trouble, even if some family members couldn't see that. Alice, on the other hand, started noticing the shift too. She wasn't oblivious, she knew her dad was stirring things up. One night she asked me, "Is it because of me that they're not coming around? I didn't want to lie." "It's not your fault, Alice. Some people just don't understand, and that's on them, not you." She nodded, and for a moment I saw that same look she had when we picked her up, part relief, part uncertainty. I knew we were doing the right thing, but I also knew the situation would only get more complicated from here. So, once the family drama started, things got pretty awkward. We continued hosting our usual dinners and gatherings, but instead of the usual bustling crowd filling up the house and fields, it felt strangely empty. Some family members just stopped coming altogether, while the ones who did show up seemed like they were caught in an uncomfortable spot. There was a lot of whispering, sidelong glances at Alice, like they were weighing whether it was worth the tension. Alice noticed too. She'd pick at her food during dinner, stay quiet, and seemed on edge, as if she was bracing for someone to ask her to leave. But my wife and I made sure she knew that wasn't going to happen. Then came the day we planned a gathering for my uncle's birthday, a type of event that would normally bring the whole family together. We'd have tables set up outside, the fire pit going, kids running around. It was the kind of event everyone looked forward to. But this time, people started backing out last minute. Cousin Lisa called, saying her kids were sick and they couldn't make it. Uncle Tom mentioned something about being too busy with work, and Aunt Linda claimed she wasn't feeling well. It was like everyone suddenly had a reason not to come. But I knew better they weren't skipping because they were avoiding Alice. I didn't want to mention it to Alice, but my wife caught on from my expression. She gave me that look that said, not in front of her, so I kept my mouth shut and tried to act like everything was normal. When the day came, only a small group of people showed up. We made the best of it, grilled some food, kept a small fire going, but you could feel the tension in the air. Everyone was tiptoeing around the situation. At one point, Bill and Tanya arrived, and I knew right away it was going to be trouble. They hadn't visited the farm since Alice moved in, and from the way Tanya was glaring at her, I could tell this wasn't a social call. Bill tried to make small talk with some family members, but Tanya headed straight for me as I stood by the grill. "You know this isn't helping anyone," she began, arms crossed, looking tense. I played dumb, though I knew exactly what she was referring to. "What do you mean?" She sighed dramatically, as if she was dealing with a child. "Alice, keeping her here isn't helping her, and it's just stirring up all this drama in the family." I set down the spatula, meeting her gaze. "Tanya, we're giving her a place to stay because she needs it. That's all." She didn't back down. "Well, Bill and I think it's time she moves on," she said, frustration clear in her voice. "She's 18 now, she needs to learn how to be independent." I felt my temper rising, and it wasn't from the heat of the grill. "Learn independence? You two kicked her out without a safety net. That's not teaching her to be self-reliant, that's abandoning her." By this point, some of the family members nearby had gone quiet, listening closely. Alice was over by the barn, helping my wife set up some things, but I could see a few people exchanging looks, eager to see how this conversation would play out. Tanya leaned in closer, lowering her voice like she was issuing a threat. "Bill and I don't appreciate you interfering in our family matters." I stood my ground. "Well, maybe if you treated her like part of your family, I wouldn't have to." That was the breaking point. She threw up her hands and walked off, muttering something about how stubborn I was and how we'd regret this. A few minutes later, Bill approached me, looking frustrated. "You know, we're not trying to be the bad guys here," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. "But Alice needs to move on. This isn't helping her grow." I took a deep breath, trying to keep calm. "Bill, if that's what you think, then why didn't you help her out before all this? Why wait until she turned 18 to push her out the door?" He shifted uneasily, like he didn't have a good answer. "It's not that simple," he muttered. I shook my head. "I think it is that simple, and until she's ready to leave, she's staying here." "That's final." He didn't respond, just gave me a look like I had let him down somehow, then walked away. The rest of the evening stayed tense. People tried to carry on as if nothing had happened, but it was clear that the confrontation had dampened the atmosphere. Bill and Tanya left early, and a few others followed shortly after. Once they were gone, my wife pulled me aside. "You did the right thing," she reassured me. "Don't let them make you feel like you're wrong." I nodded, but inside I still felt caught in the middle of a situation that seemed beyond my control. Worst of all, Alice sensed that something was wrong. After most of the guests had left and we were tidying up, she asked, "Did they leave because of me?" I hated that she thought she was the cause of all this trouble. "It's not your fault, Alice," I told her. "Some people just can't deal with things not going their way." She didn't say much after that and went back to helping with the cleanup, but I could see from her expression that it weighed on her, like she felt responsible for something that wasn't her doing. The following days were quieter. Alice kept herself occupied around the farm, and we tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. But I knew this was far from resolved. More texts and calls started coming in, family members wanting to discuss the situation. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about what we were doing. Some tried to be diplomatic, saying things like, "We just want to make sure Alice is okay," but I understood their true intention. They wanted us to send her away so things could return to their version of normal. One evening, after yet another round of calls, I sat down with my wife and Alice. It felt like we needed to have an open conversation about everything going on. "Listen, Alice," I said gently, "I know this is overwhelming, and I know it's unfair that people are making you feel like it's your fault." She looked down, fiddling with her hands. "Maybe if I wasn't here, things would go back to normal." I shook my head firmly. "No, this isn't on you. They're the ones making it difficult. You don't need to worry about that." My wife chimed in as well. "We want you here, Alice. This is your home now for as long as you need it." Alice gave a small nod, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. Given everything she'd been through, it made sense that she found it hard to trust easily. But we were committed to proving to her that she was safe with us. As the days passed, the calls kept coming, and I realized this was just the start of the family drama. No matter how many times the phone rang, or how many relatives tried to pressure us, I was certain of one thing: we weren't backing down. Alice was staying, and we were going to stand by her, even if it meant facing off against a significant portion of the family. After the tense family dinner and the barrage of messages from Bill, the atmosphere around the farm grew more strained. Alice continued to help out and tried to keep her spirits up, but I could see the stress was getting to her. My wife and I did our best to keep things as normal as possible, but when you're constantly dealing with family drama, it's hard to ignore. Then one day we had an unexpected visitor, my Uncle Tom. Now, Tom is the kind of guy who usually keeps his distance from family squabbles. He never takes sides or stirs up trouble, so when he showed up at the farm unannounced, I figured something big must be brewing. I invited him in, and we sat down at the kitchen table while my wife made some coffee. From the start, he looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat like he didn't want to be there, which told me this conversation wasn't going to be a pleasant one. "I've been talking to Bill and Tanya," he began, rubbing the back of his neck. "They're really upset about this whole situation with Alice." I sighed, already tired of hearing the same refrain. "Yeah, I've heard. So, what's the latest?" He hesitated before continuing. "They're talking about getting the whole family involved, like everyone. They want to hold a meeting, basically a family intervention, to decide what should happen with Alice." I felt my jaw tighten. A family meeting to decide what happens with Alice? She's not some project for everyone to weigh in on, Tom. She's a person. He quickly responded, "I know, I told them that. But they're convinced she needs to go back with them, and they think if enough of the family puts pressure on you, you'll change your mind." It felt like a blow. It was one thing for Bill and Tanya to disagree with us, but pulling the entire family into it took things to another level. So what, they want a vote on whether she stays? Tom shrugged, looking apologetic. "Something like that. They think if they can get enough people on their side, you'll feel like you don't have a choice." My wife, who had been listening quietly until now, finally spoke up. "That's ridiculous. This isn't a democracy. Alice is staying because she needs a place, and we're not about to throw her out just because some people don't like it." Tom nodded but still looked uneasy. "Look, I'm just giving you a heads up. They're serious about this, and they're planning to meet at Aunt Linda's place next week." It all started to make sense. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. They were trying to turn the family against us. I clenched my fists under the table. So they think they can pressure us into backing down. He raised his hands in a placating gesture. I'm not saying it's right. I just thought you should know what's coming. My wife and I exchanged a glance. We'd been trying to avoid further conflict, but now it was clear that wasn't possible. They were turning this into a full-blown family issue, and we had to decide whether to hold our ground or let them push us around. After Tom left, we sat in silence, trying to figure out our next move. My wife suggested that we reach out to a few family members who had been supportive to see if they'd stand with us. It wasn't about taking sides, it was about making sure Alice knew she wasn't alone. In the following days, we made some calls. We reached out to Lisa, a cousin who had supported us from the start. When she heard about the planned meeting, she was furious. That's insane, she said. They're acting like Alice is some problem to be solved. She's better off with you, and they know it. We also reached out to a few aunts and uncles who had been neutral before. Some were hesitant to get involved, but a few agreed that what Bill and Tanya were doing was wrong. They promised to attend the meeting at Aunt Linda's house and speak up for Alice if things got out of hand. Meanwhile, Alice was doing her best to act like everything was okay, but I could see the anxiety creeping in. One evening, while we were out feeding the animals, she finally brought it up. Is it true that they're having a meeting about me? She asked quietly. I nodded. Yeah, it's true. But we're not going to let them make you do anything you don't want to. She looked down at her boots, kicking at the dirt. I just don't get why they're so determined to make me leave. They didn't want me when I lived there. I put a hand on her shoulder, hoping to reassure her. It's not about you, Alice. They just want to control the situation. They can't stand that we made a decision they disagree with, I explained. She sighed, looking down. I don't want to cause more problems. You're not the problem, I replied firmly. They are, and we're standing by you no matter what. The following week, the day of the so-called intervention arrived. We knew we had to attend. Even though we didn't want to, if we didn't show up, they'd likely assume we were backing down. So we climbed into the truck and drove over to Aunt Linda's place. As soon as we walked in, the tension was palpable. Almost the entire family was there, cousins, uncles, aunts, everyone. Bill and Tanya sat at the head of the table, looking like they were presiding over a formal meeting. Alice stayed close to my wife, clearly uneasy. I noticed the concerned glances from a few relatives who had promised to support us. Bill stood up, trying to sound authoritative. Thank you all for coming. We're here to discuss what's best for Alice. I rolled my eyes. What's best for Alice, or what's best for you? Tanya jumped in quickly. This isn't about us. It's about making sure Alice has a stable future, and we believe that means coming back home. My wife folded her arms. You mean going back to the home she was kicked out of? Bill ignored her, launching into a speech about how the family needed to come together and how this situation was creating a divide among us. It was all a bunch of talk meant to make them look like the victims. A few cousins tried to chime in, but it was clear Bill and Tanya had managed to sway most of the room. Then, just as the discussion was getting heated, Lisa stood up. This is absurd, she said firmly. Alice has a home where she's safe, loved, and doing well. If you genuinely cared about her, you'd support that instead of trying to push her back into a situation she doesn't want. A few others nodded, but most remained silent. I could see that this was going to be an uphill battle. Bill kept pushing, saying we were isolating Alice and making her dependent on us. It was all nonsense, but he was speaking with enough conviction that some of the others seemed to believe him. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up and said, "This isn't a democracy. Alice is an adult, and she's made her decision. We're not here to debate it. If you don't like it, that's your problem." There was a long pause, and then people began leaving the room one by one. Some gave us nods of support while others walked past without saying a word. Bill and Tanya stayed behind, glaring at us. "We're not done with this," Bill warned as we headed for the door. "Yeah, well, we are," I shot back. As we drove home, Alice looked more relieved than I had seen her in weeks. We knew it wasn't the end of the conflict, but at least she understood that we were on her side, no matter what the rest of the family decided. As the start of Alice's university classes approached, it seemed like things were finally settling down a bit. She had been working hard on the farm, finding a rhythm, and it felt like she was beginning to find her footing. My wife and I stayed optimistic, hoping that once Alice started school, the family drama might ease up. We figured that if she was stable and had a routine, maybe Bill and Tanya would back off. Then, just when we thought we could finally relax, my phone rang. It was Bill. I knew I shouldn't have answered, but a small part of me hoped he might be ready to make peace, to realize how much this whole situation had stressed Alice out. I should have known better. "Hey man," I answered, trying to keep my tone neutral. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I heard Alice is getting therapy," he said, his voice icy. "Yeah, she is," I replied, already bracing for the inevitable argument. "She's been through a lot and needs someone to talk to." "Well, I don't know why you think that's necessary," he shot back. "We raised her fine. She doesn't need therapy." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Bill? She was kicked out of her home and has been through a lot. She needs support." "Support," he scoffed. "Or are you just making her think she's a victim?" That was my breaking point. I struggled to keep my composure. "I'm not making her think anything, Bill. She has the opportunity to get help and move forward. If you can't see that, maybe you're part of the problem." There was silence on the other end, but I could almost hear him grinding his teeth. "You've changed, you know that? You used to respect family. Now you're the one causing division." His words stung. My wife and I had built our farm as a place for family gatherings, somewhere everyone could feel welcome. And now he was acting like I was the one tearing everything apart. It felt like a slap in the face, but I wasn't about to back down. "Bill, I'm doing what I think is right. You don't have to agree with it, but Alice is staying here, and we're not sending her away just to make things easier for you." He hung up without another word. I sat there for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. It felt like all the efforts we'd put into helping Alice and building a sense of security for her were being turned against us. I was angry, but mostly I just felt exhausted, like no matter what we did, someone would always find a way to twist it into something negative. Later that night, I sat down with my wife to discuss everything. We knew that once Alice began her classes, her routine would shift, and maybe the family pressure would lessen when they saw she was doing okay. My wife suggested we host a small gathering before her classes started, a simple dinner with a few close family members who had supported us, as a way to show Alice that she had a community backing her. We planned the dinner as a low-key celebration, just to let Alice know we were proud of her and that she had a place where she was appreciated. The evening of the dinner went smoothly. A few cousins came by, along with some aunts and uncles. For a while it almost felt like old times. Alice seemed happy, chatting and laughing with everyone. It was a rare moment of peace, where it felt like we could actually enjoy each other's company without any tension. But of course that calm didn't last long. Just as we were finishing dinner, I spotted Bill's car coming up the driveway. I knew immediately that this wasn't going to be a friendly visit. He hadn't set foot on the farm since this whole mess began, so seeing him arrive now didn't feel like a good omen. He got out of the car with Tanya by his side, and they approached the house. You could sense the tension thickening in the air. A few of my cousins exchanged nervous glances, and Alice's smile faded the moment she spotted them. My wife and I exchanged a knowing look. We both knew this wouldn't end well. Bill wasted no time. He walked right up to us, and with all eyes on him, he said, "We need to talk." Now I kept my composure, trying to maintain some civility. "All right, let's step aside and discuss this privately." But he shook his head. "No, we're doing this here, in front of everyone." Tanya stood beside him, arms crossed, looking like she was ready for a confrontation. I glanced at Alice, who looked like she was dreading what was coming. Honestly, I was expecting the worst too, but I wasn't going to let Bill make a spectacle in front of everyone. "Fine," I said, crossing my arms. "What's this about?" Bill took a deep breath, as if preparing for a speech. "We've given this a lot of thought, and we think it's time for Alice to come home." The room fell silent. I noticed a few people exchanging confused looks, and Alice seemed stunned, unsure of how to respond. I was equally taken aback. After all this time, they suddenly wanted her back. Tanya stepped forward and added, "We think it's best if she comes back to live with us. We want to fix things as a family." Alice remained silent, staring down at her plate. My wife placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. I didn't understand Bill and Tanya's sudden change of heart, but I wasn't about to let them pressure Alice into returning. "She's staying here, Bill. We've already been through this." Bill's expression grew stern. "We don't want her here anymore. She belongs with us." Finally, Alice spoke up, her voice quiet yet firm. "I don't want to go back." She looked her dad in the eye for the first time. "You only want me back now because you don't want to look bad in front of the family." Tanya's face twisted with anger. "How dare you talk to us like that?" But Alice didn't back down. "You kicked me out. You didn't care where I went or what happened to me. Now you show up here, pretending everything's fine." Bill's expression was difficult to read, but I could tell his patience was wearing thin. "We're your family, Alice. You can't just run away from that." My wife rose to her feet, her voice calm but unwavering. "She's not running away. She's trying to start over, and we're here to support her." Tanya rolled her eyes. "Oh, so now you two think you're her saviors? This is why the family's divided, because you keep interfering." I had reached my limit. "Interfering? You kicked her out. We took her in because that's what family should do." Bill shook his head and looked around the room, as if hoping for support. "This isn't how it's supposed to be. Alice belongs with us, and you need to stop getting in the way of that." I felt my fists clenching but tried to keep my composure. "Alice is staying here, and that's final." Bill looked like he wanted to argue further, but then something seemed to change. He just stared at me for a moment before turning to Alice. "Fine, stay here, but don't expect us to keep trying. We're done with this." He turned on his heel, with Tanya trailing behind him. The silence that followed was heavy, and everyone seemed to be processing what had just unfolded. Alice sat there, staring down at her plate, and I noticed tears beginning to well up in her eyes. My wife and I didn't press her to talk about it. We simply sat beside her, making sure she knew we were there for her. It wasn't the outcome we had hoped for, but at least now she knew who truly had her back.